Chapter 21. The Siege of Castle Orlock. The storm clouds that hung over Castle Orlock were thick and menacing, blotting out the moon and stars. Lightning erst across the jagged spires of the fortress, illuminating the crumbling walls and casting fleeting shadows over the horde of undead that surrounded the castle. The moaning of the risen dead filled the night air, a chilling cacophony of despair and menace. At the edge of the wordwood, Hendrik, Lukas, and Father Albrecht stood with the surviving villagers from Dunkelwald and Wolfsbach, armed with pitchforks, axes, and makeshift shields. The odds were grim, but desperation had forged the group into a determined force. "This is madness," Hendrik muttered, gripping the hilt of a borrowed sword. His usual satchel of books and notes hung at his side, but tonight it felt like a burden rather than a lifeline. "It's the only way," Lukas said, his voice cold and steady. His pistol gleamed faintly in the flickering light of the lantern. "We draw Nyklas's forces to the walls and force his hand. While they're focused on us, we slip into the crypts and destroy the Soulstone." Father Albrecht raised the Lantern of Sanctity, its blessed light cutting through the darkness. "Sigmar's light will guide us," he said firmly, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his doubt. Hendrik cast a wary glance at the villagers. Most of them were farmers and tradesmen, untrained for battle but resolved to fight for their homes and families. Their faces were pale with fear, but their eyes burned with determination. "Let's get this over with," Hendrik said, steeling himself for what was to come. The first wave of the assault was a chaotic charge across the open field toward the castle gates. The villagers shouted battle cries, their voices trembling but fierce, as they advanced with torches and weapons held high. Lukas led the charge, his rapier flashing as he felled the first zombie that shambled toward them. Hendrik stayed close behind, swinging his sword awkwardly, but managing to keep the undead at bay. The undead forces responded swiftly. Skeletons armed with rusted swords and shields emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolent light. Abominations, stitched together horrors of flesh and bone, roared as they charged, their misshapen limbs swinging wildly. Father Albrecht stood at the rear of the group, chanting prayers as the lantern's light flared brightly. The holy glow burned through the undead ranks, causing them to falter and crumble. The villagers rallied around the light, their courage bolstered as they pressed forward. "Hold the line," Lukas shouted, cutting down another skeleton. "We can't let them overwhelm us." Despite their initial success, the horde's sheer numbers began to take their toll. For every undead creature they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The villagers fought valiantly, but the weight of the enemy's relentless assault was overwhelming. "We're not going to hold much longer," Hendrik shouted, his voice hoarse. "We don't need to," Lukas replied. "Albrecht, light the way." The priest nodded and raised the lantern high. Its golden light surged outward, creating a brief reprieve as the undead recoiled from the divine radiance. "This way," Lukas called, leading Hendrik and a small group of villagers toward a hidden passage near the castle's base. The rest of the villagers, led by a grizzled farmer named Jorgen, remained behind to hold the line. "Don't let them through," Jorgen roared, brandishing an axe as he stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. "For Dunkelwald, for Sigmar." Hendrik glanced back as they ran, guilt gnawing at him for leaving the villagers to face the brunt of the horde. But he knew their sacrifice was necessary. If they didn't succeed in destroying the Soulstone, none of this would matter. The hidden passage led them into the castle's lower levels, where the air was thick with mildew and the faint stench of death. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stone corridor. "Stay alert," Lukas said, his voice a low whisper. "Nyklas will have more than undead waiting for us." As they approached the entrance to the crypts, they encountered their first obstacle, a pair of undead knights clad in rusted armor, their glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The knights raised their swords in unison and charged, their movements unnervingly fast. Lukas met them head-on, his rapier darting between the joints in their armor. Hendrik and one of the villagers, a blacksmith named Karl, flanked the second knight. Hendrik's swing glanced off the knight's shield, but Karl's hammer struck true, shattering the creature's helmet and sending it crashing to the ground. "We're close," Albrecht said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Soulstone's presence is stronger here." As they descended deeper into the crypts, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The faint glow of the Soulstone could be seen in the distance, its eerie light casting long shadows. But before they could reach it, the air grew cold, and a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "You truly are persistent." Nyklas von Karstein stepped from the shadows, his form elegant yet menacing. His crimson cloak billowed behind him, and his pale, sharp features were illuminated by the Soulstone's glow. Beside him stood Lady Irina, her beauty as chilling as it was otherworldly. "You should have fled while you had the chance," Nyklas said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Now you've brought death upon yourselves." Lukas stepped forward, his rapier raised. "We're not here to negotiate, vampire. This ends tonight." Nyklas smiled, his fangs glinting in the dim light. "Indeed it does." With a flick of his wrist, Nyklas summoned more undead knights, their heavy footfalls echoing in the crypt. Irina's eyes glowed as she unleashed a wave of dark magic, forcing the group to scatter. "Go for the Soulstone?" Lukas shouted. "I'll hold them off." Hendrik hesitated, torn between helping Lukas and following his orders. Albrecht grabbed his arm, his expression resolute. "We must trust him. Come." They pushed forward, weaving through the chaos as Lukas and the villagers engaged Nyklas and his minions. The Soulstone pulsed with energy, its light growing brighter as they approached. "Sigmar, guide us," Albrecht whispered, raising the lantern. Its light pierced the darkness, clearing a path to the pedestal. Hendrik reached the Soulstone first, its cold, unnatural energy coursing through him as he placed his hands on it. The artifact seemed to resist him, its power surging in defiance. "Do it," Albrecht shouted, holding the lantern high. Hendrik gritted his teeth and nodded. "For Sigmar. For all of us." Chapter 22. Descent into Darkness. The air in the catacombs of Castle Orlock was colder than the deepest winter night, carrying the faint stench of rot and decay. The flickering light of the Lantern of Sanctity barely pushed back the oppressive darkness, and every step felt like a descent into another layer of torment. Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, his breath shallow as he scanned the stone walls for signs of traps or danger. "Stay close," Lukas Dietrich whispered, his rapier glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. His eyes darted between the shadows, his movements tense but deliberate. Father Albrecht walked beside him, murmuring prayers under his breath as his hammer pendant swayed with each step. The group pressed forward, the silence broken only by the faint drip of water from the ceiling and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the distance. The first trap revealed itself in a flash of movement. Hendrik barely had time to shout a warning as a series of razor-sharp blades sprung from the walls, slicing through the air in deadly arcs. Lukas shoved Hendrik back, narrowly avoiding the spinning blades as they retracted into the walls. "They're not just protecting the Soulstone," Lukas growled. "They're protecting everything Nyklas doesn't want seen." Hendrik knelt to examine the mechanism, his hands shaking. The trap was ancient but well-maintained, its gears oiled and sharp edges gleaming. "These weren't made by Nyklas," he said. "This is older, far older." Albrecht nodded solemnly. "The knights who built these catacombs knew what would come. They prepared as best they could." "Then we better be just as prepared," Lukas said. "Keep moving." The traps grew more insidious as they delved deeper. Spiked pits yawned beneath their feet, hidden by rotted planks. Jets of green flame burst from hidden alcoves, scorching the stone walls. Hendrik's heart pounded as he disarmed a pressure plate, his sweat-soaked fingers fumbling with the ancient mechanism. "This is madness," he muttered. "Every step we take feels like a step closer to death." The traps gave way to a new horror as the group entered a vast chamber. Torches burned dimly along the walls, illuminating grotesque sights that froze Hendrik in his tracks. Metal tables lined the room, each one occupied by a figure that could barely be called human. Bodies stitched together from various parts lay strapped to the slabs, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Some twitched as if trying to move, while others let out faint, guttural moans. Jars filled with murky liquid lined the walls, containing disembodied limbs, organs, and grotesque fetuses suspended in preservation. "Sigmar preserve us," Albrecht whispered, clutching his pendant tightly. "What manner of blasphemy is this?" "Nyklas's experiments," Lukas said grimly. "He's not just raising the dead, he's creating them." Hendrik felt bile rise in his throat as he approached one of the tables. The creature strapped to it was a monstrous amalgamation of human and animal parts, its flesh sewn together with black thread. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, and its eyes followed Hendrik's movements, filled with a pain that was almost human. "This is beyond necromancy," Hendrik said, his voice trembling. "This is something else. Something worse." "He's building an army," Lukas said, his tone sharp. "These things aren't just for show. They're weapons." A low growl echoed through the chamber, and the group turned as one. From the far end of the room, a massive figure emerged, its twisted form illuminated by the flickering torches. It was one of Nyklas's creations, a hulking monstrosity with claws as long as swords and a head that resembled a wolf's skull, fused with a human face. "It's guarding the way forward," Lukas said, stepping in front of the group. "Get ready." The creature lunged, its claws tearing through the air with terrifying speed. Lukas met it head-on, his rapier darting between its ribs, but the beast barely flinched. It swiped at him, forcing him to roll aside as its claws gouged deep marks into the stone floor. Albrecht raised the Lantern of Sanctity, its light flaring brightly. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl as its flesh sizzled under the holy glow. Hendrik scrambled to find a weapon, his hands trembling as he grabbed a discarded torch. "Keep it back," Lukas shouted, slashing at the beast's legs. Albrecht used the lantern. "I'm trying," the priest replied, his voice strained as he struggled to hold the light steady. The beast roared and lunged at Albrecht, but Hendrik stepped forward, thrusting the burning torch into its face. The creature howled, retreating momentarily as flames licked at its malformed flesh. Lukas seized the opportunity, driving his rapier into the creature's chest with all his strength. The blade pierced its heart, and with a final, deafening scream, the monstrosity collapsed in a heap, its body twitching before going still. As they caught their breath, Hendrik turned back to the rows of experiments. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the grotesque creations, each one a testament to Nyklas's depravity. "This is what he does," Hendrik said quietly. "He takes life and twists it into something unrecognizable. How can we fight against this?" "We fight because we must," Lukas said, cleaning his blade. "Because if we don't, no one else will." Albrecht placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. "These horrors are meant to break your spirit, to make you lose hope. But we cannot falter. The Soulstone is close. I can feel its power." Hendrik nodded, though the weight of what he had seen pressed heavily on him. "Let's keep moving." The way forward. They exited the chamber and descended deeper into the catacombs, the air growing colder with each step. The faint glow of the Soulstone's power could be seen in the distance, a pulsing light that seemed to draw them forward and repel them at the same time. "We're almost there," Albrecht said, his voice filled with both determination and dread. "But the worst is yet to come." Hendrik tightened his grip on the lantern, his resolve hardening. The horrors they had witnessed would haunt him forever. But he knew there was no turning back. Nyklas's evil had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As they moved closer to their goal, the oppressive darkness of the catacombs seemed to press in around them, whispering of despair and death. But within Hendrik, a small ember of hope remained, flickering stubbornly against the void. Chapter 23. The Soulstone Revealed. The catacombs seemed to stretch endlessly, the oppressive darkness broken only by the faint golden glow of the Lantern of Sanctity. The faint hum of dark energy had grown louder as the group ventured deeper, resonating through the walls and filling the air with a nauseating tension. Each step felt heavier, as though the very stones beneath their feet resisted their progress. "This is it," Father Albrecht whispered, his voice taut with both awe and dread. The Soulstone is near. Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, its blessed light flickering in his trembling hands. The air had grown colder, biting into his skin even through his heavy cloak. Beside him, Lukas Dietrich moved with grim determination, his rapier glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. The faint sound of whispers echoed the corridor, unintelligible but insistent, as though the catacombs themselves were alive with malevolent intent. Ahead, a massive stone door loomed in the darkness, its surface engraved with intricate runes that pulsed faintly with crimson light. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe as though imbued with a dark will of their own. "This must be it," Hendrik said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lukas stepped forward, examining the door. Nyklas wouldn't leave this unguarded. "Be ready." The runes on the door flared brightly as Albrecht raised the lantern, its holy light pushing against the crimson glow. With a groaning sound, the door began to slide open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The room was immense, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center stood a raised dais, carved from black stone and surrounded by jagged spires. Atop the dais rested the Soulstone of Lahmia, its jagged surface glowing with an unholy light. The artifact pulsed rhythmically, like the beat of a monstrous heart, and with each pulse the air seemed to shudder. Hendrik felt an overwhelming sense of dread as he stepped into the chamber. The Soulstone's energy was palpable, pressing against his chest and filling his mind with whispers of despair and temptation. This is it," he murmured, his voice trembling. "The source of Nyklas's power." The Soulstone was larger than he had imagined, a jagged shard of black crystal veined with crimson. Its glow bathed the chamber in a sickly light, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "It's worse than I feared," Albrecht said, his face pale. "This is no mere relic. It is a gateway, a conduit for the darkest magics imaginable." Lukas gripped his rapier tightly, his jaw set. "Then we destroy it, quickly before." A low rumble interrupted him, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The air grew colder, and the whispers that had been faint now rose to a deafening cacophony. From the shadows surrounding the dais, figures began to emerge. At first they appeared human, but as they stepped into the Soulstone's crimson light, their true forms became clear. These were no ordinary undead. Their decayed bodies were clad in ancient, rusted armor, their hollow eyes burning with malevolent energy. Each carried a massive weapon, greatswords, axes, and maces, that glowed faintly with the same crimson light as the Soulstone. "Guardians," Albrecht said, his voice grim. "Nyklas has bound them to the Soulstone. They will defend it to the death, and beyond." The Guardians advanced slowly, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and the whispers in the chamber grew louder, their words now clear. "Leave. Flee. Despair." Lukas stepped forward, his pistol aimed at the nearest Guardian. "Get ready. This won't be easy." The first Guardian charged, its greatsword swinging in a wide arc. Lukas dodged to the side, his rapier flashing as he struck the creature's exposed joints. The blade bit into the decayed flesh, but the Guardian didn't falter, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Hendrik raised the lantern, its holy light flaring brightly. The Guardians recoiled, their movements slowing as the divine energy pushed against them. "Keep the light steady," Albrecht shouted, raising his hammer pendant. "Sigmar's power is our only hope." The priest's prayers echoed through the chamber, the holy words cutting through the whispers. A wave of golden light surged outward, burning away the dark energy that animated the nearest Guardian. It let out a guttural roar before collapsing into a heap of rusted armor and ash. But the remaining Guardians pressed on, their movements growing faster and more coordinated. One lunged at Hendrik, its mace swinging down with terrifying force. He stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the blow as the lantern wavered in his grasp. "Focus." Lukas barked, driving his rapier into another Guardian's chest. The blade pierced its armor, but the creature grabbed him with its skeletal hand, lifting him off the ground. Albrecht rushed forward, his hammer pendant glowing brightly. With a shout, he struck the guardian, the holy energy coursing through his weapon, shattering the creature's arm. Lukas dropped to the ground, coughing but unharmed. As the battle raged, the Soulstone's glow intensified. The whispers grew louder, filling Hendrik's mind with images of despair and futility. He saw visions of the villagers he had left behind, their faces twisted in agony as Nyklas's forces overwhelmed them. He saw himself falling to the undead, his body rising as a thrall to serve Nyklas for eternity. "Don't listen to it," Albrecht shouted, his voice cutting through the illusions. "The Soulstone preys on your fear. Trust in the light." Hendrik gritted his teeth and raised the lantern higher, its glow pushing back the shadows and silencing the whispers. He locked eyes with the Soulstone, its pulsating light almost hypnotic. "We have to end this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Now." Albrecht nodded, raising his hammer pendant once more. "To destroy it, we must complete the rite of purification. But first, we must secure the chamber." Lukas dispatched the last guardian with a swift strike, its armor clattering to the ground as it disintegrated. The chamber fell silent, save for the hum of the Soulstone and the labored breathing of the group. The three stood before the daze, the Soulstone's light casting eerie shadows across their faces. Hendrik felt a wave of nausea as he stared at the artifact, its power radiating like a living presence. "This is it," Albrecht said, his voice trembling but resolute. "The final step. We destroy the Soulstone, and Nyklas's power crumbles." "And if we fail?" Hendrik asked. "We don't fail," Lukas said firmly, his rapier still dripping with dark ichor. "We can't." Hendrik took a deep breath and nodded. The weight of their task pressed heavily on him, but for the first time he felt a spark of determination. The Soulstone was the source of Nyklas's power, the heart of his darkness, and it would end here, no matter the cost. Chapter 24. Nyklas's True Form. The oppressive silence in the Soulstone's chamber shattered like glass as the stone's pulsating hum deepened into a deafening roar. The crimson light intensified, casting jagged shadows on the walls that seemed to writhe like living things. The air turned icy, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. From the far end of the chamber, a chilling voice echoed through the darkness. "You've come far, but you've made a grave mistake." Nyklas von Karstein stepped into the light of the Lantern of Sanctity, his once polished and refined appearance replaced by something far more sinister. His crimson cloak billowed behind him like a pool of blood, and his pale skin glowed faintly in the Soulstone's light. His sharp features were now grotesquely exaggerated, his fangs gleaming like daggers. His eyes burned with a hellish red light, filled with malice and hunger. "You think you can destroy what I have built?" Nyklas snarled, his voice no longer human. It was guttural, layered with the voices of countless souls trapped by his magic. "You are nothing but insects before the might of the von Karsteins." As the group steadied themselves, Nyklas stepped forward, his form shifting and expanding. His limbs elongated unnaturally, his hands transforming into clawed talons. His cloak seemed to merge with his body, forming leathery wings that unfurled with a menacing hiss. His face contorted, his mouth widening into a fanged maw, and his entire body pulsed with the same dark energy as the Soulstone. Nyklas's voice became a growl, reverberating through the chamber. "This is my domain. You cannot stand against me." Hendrik clutched the lantern tightly, its golden light flickering in the face of Nyklas's overwhelming presence. What is he?" he stammered. "A true vampire lord," Father Albrecht said, his voice heavy with dread. "Nyklas has shed his human facade. This is his true form." Nyklas spread his wings, his monstrous form towering over them. "You should feel honored. Few lived long enough to see my power in its entirety." Nyklas raised a clawed hand, and the Soulstone flared brightly. The walls of the chamber groaned as undead guardians burst forth from hidden alcoves, their weapons glowing with crimson energy. The moaning of the risen dead filled the air as they surrounded the group. "Hold the line," Lukas shouted, his rapier flashing as he cut down the first guardian to reach them. "Don't let him divide us." The group fought desperately, their weapons striking against the seemingly endless tide of undead. Albrecht held the Lantern of Sanctity high, its holy light burning away the dark energy animating the lesser undead. But even its power seemed to falter in the presence of the Soulstone. Nyklas watched with a cruel smile, his wings spreading as he hovered above the battle. "Is this all you have?" he mocked. "You cannot hope to stop me." With a sweep of his claw, Nyklas unleashed a wave of necrotic energy. It struck the ground with a deafening crash, sending Hendrik and Albrecht sprawling. The light of the lantern dimmed, and the undead pressed their advantage. Hendrik scrambled to his feet, gripping the lantern tightly. He swung it at an advancing guardian, the holy light searing through its decayed flesh. "We can't hold them off forever," he shouted. "We don't need forever," Lukas replied, firing his pistol a skeletal knight. "Just long enough to destroy the Soulstone." Nyklas landed with a thunderous crash, his claws raking across the ground. He charged at Lukas, his monstrous speed catching the witch hunter off guard. Lukas raised his rapier just in time to deflect a claw swipe, but the force of the blow sent him flying into a nearby pillar. "You are weak," Nyklas sneered, advancing on Lukas, a pitiful shadow of the Empire's once great defenders. Albrecht intervened, stepping between Nyklas and Lukas. The priest raised his hammer pendant, its golden glow flaring brightly. "Sigmar's light will strike you down, fiend," he declared. Nyklas snarled, shielding his eyes from the holy light. With a roar, he lashed out with his wings, knocking Albrecht to the ground. The pendant clattered across the floor, its light dimming. Hendrik stared in horror as Nyklas approached the dais. The Soulstone pulsed with renewed energy, and the whispers in the chamber grew deafening. "You see," Nyklas said, turning to face them, "this is power, true power. You cannot destroy me, for I am eternal." With a wave of his hand, the Soulstone's energy surged, and the undead seemed to grow stronger. Their movements became faster, their attacks more coordinated. Hendrik barely managed to avoid a blow from a skeletal knight, his heart pounding as he swung the lantern wildly. "We have to stop him," Hendrik shouted. "We have to destroy the Soulstone now." Lukas struggled to his feet, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. "Albrecht, can you perform the rite?" The priest groaned as he pushed himself up, his hand reaching for the fallen pendant. I can try, but I'll need time." "Then we'll buy you time," Lukas said, his voice firm. He turned to Hendrik. "Keep the lantern on him. The light weakens his power." Hendrik stepped forward, the Lantern of Sanctity raised high. Its golden light flared brightly, pushing back the crimson glow of the Soulstone. Nyklas snarled, shielding his face with a wing as the holy energy seared his monstrous form. "You think this will stop me?" Nyklas roared. "You are nothing but insects before my power." "Maybe," Hendrik said, his voice trembling but steady. "But even the smallest light can pierce the darkness." Nyklas lunged at him, his claws slashing through the air. Hendrik dodged, the lantern's light flickering as he stumbled backward. Lukas and Albrecht rushed to his aid, their combined efforts forcing Nyklas to retreat momentarily. As the battle raged on, Albrecht knelt before the Soulstone, the hammer pendant clutched tightly in his hands. He began chanting the rite of purification, his voice rising above the cacophony of whispers and battle cries. Nyklas turned, his eyes blazing with fury. "No," he bellowed, "you will not take this from me." He charged at Albrecht, but Lukas intercepted him, his rapier slashing at the vampire lord's wings. Hendrik swung the lantern, its light flaring as it struck Nyklas's side. The vampire roared in pain, his movements slowing under the holy assault. "Keep him back!" Albrecht shouted, his voice unwavering as the ritual reached its crescendo. The Soulstone began to tremble, its light flickering erratically. The whispers grew frantic, their tone shifting from temptation to fear. Nyklas's monstrous form seemed to falter, his confidence replaced by desperation. "You cannot stop me," Nyklas roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I am eternal." Hendrik and Lukas stood their ground, their weapons raised as the light of the Lantern of Sanctity burned brighter. Together, they pushed Nyklas back, their resolve unyielding. The battle was far from over, but for the first time they glimpsed the possibility of victory. Chapter 25. The Priest's Sacrifice. The chamber shook violently, the unholy energy of the Soulstone pulsing erratically as Father Albrecht knelt before it, his voice rising in fervent prayer. The golden light of the Lantern of Sanctity flickered with desperation, its holy radiance warring against the crimson glow of the cursed artifact. The air crackled with tension as the whispers of the Soulstone became a roar, echoing its resistance. Nyklas von Karstein stood at the edge of the dais, his monstrous form towering over the priest. His clawed hands twitched with rage, his fanged maw twisting into a snarl as he advanced. "You think your pitiful prayers can undo my power?" he growled, his voice layered with the voices of the countless souls bound to him. "You will die like all the others." Hendrik and Lukas moved to intercept him, their weapons raised. "Stay back," Lukas shouted, his rapier gleaming in the lantern's glow. "You'll face us first." Nyklas barely spared them a glance. "You are nothing but gnats." With a sweep of his arm, he unleashed a wave of necrotic energy, sending the pair sprawling across the stone floor. "Your priest will die by my hand." Albrecht clutched his hammer pendant tightly, his hands trembling not with fear, but with the strain of channeling Sigmar's light into the corrupted crypt. "Sigmar, hear my prayer," he intoned, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Let your light cleanse this unholy place. Let your wrath strike down this darkness." The Soulstone pulsed again, its light dimming slightly as if recoiling from the power of the prayer. Nyklas hesitated, his fiery eyes narrowing as he sensed the shift. "You cannot win," Nyklas said, his tone laced with anger and desperation. "This place is mine. My power is absolute." But Albrecht stood firm, his voice rising. "Your power is a shadow, a mockery of life. Sigmar's light will pierce it, as the sun pierces the night." As Nyklas lunged toward Albrecht, Lukas intercepted him, his rapier striking against the vampire's clawed hand. The blow deflected Nyklas's attack, but left Lukas vulnerable. Nyklas retaliated with a brutal swipe, sending the witch hunter crashing into a pillar. Hendrik rushed forward, swinging the lantern toward Nyklas. Its holy light flared brightly, forcing the vampire lord to retreat momentarily. "You won't touch him," Hendrik shouted, his voice trembling but resolute. Nyklas snarled, his wings spreading wide as he unleashed another wave of necrotic energy. The ground beneath them cracked, and the undead guardians in the chamber began to stir, their shattered forms reanimating under the influence of the Soulstone. Albrecht's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough," he bellowed, his tone filled with righteous fury. He rose to his feet, his hammer pendant glowing with a brilliance that rivaled the lantern. "I will end this. Say." Albrecht turned to Hendrik and Lukas, his eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. "You must finish this," he said. "Destroy the Soulstone. Stop Nyklas. But to do so, this place must be sanctified. The darkness must be purged." Hendrik's heart sank as he realized what Albrecht was saying. "No, there must be another way." "There isn't," Albrecht said firmly. "This place is steeped in corruption. To cleanse it, a sacrifice must be made. My soul will anchor Sigmar's light here, allowing you to finish what we started." "Albrecht, no," Lukas shouted, staggering to his feet. "We need you." "You need the light," Albrecht replied. "And this is the only way." Nyklas roared, surging toward the dais. "You will not take this from me." Albrecht raised the pendant high, its golden light surging outward with a force that stopped Nyklas in his tracks. The vampire screamed in pain as the holy energy burned his monstrous form, forcing him to retreat. Turning back to the Soulstone, Albrecht pressed the pendant against its jagged surface. The artifact pulsed violently, the crimson light flaring as it fought against the divine power. "Sigmar, guide me," Albrecht whispered. "Let your light cleanse this place. Let your servant be your instrument." With a final, deafening roar, the light from the pendant erupted, engulfing the chamber. The crimson glow of the Soulstone faltered, dimming as the holy energy poured into it. Albrecht's body shone with divine radiance, his form dissolving into pure light as he became one with the sanctity of the crypt. As the light faded, the chamber fell silent. The undead guardians crumbled into dust, their connection to the Soulstone severed. Nyklas staggered, his monstrous form weakened and flickering as though barely held together. Hendrik fell to his knees, the lantern still clutched in his hands. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at the spot where Albrecht had stood moments before. He's gone. Lukas placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder, his face grim but resolute. He did what he had to. And now, it's up to us to finish this. The Soulstone's light was dim but still pulsing faintly, its power greatly diminished but not yet destroyed. Nyklas growled, his fiery eyes locking onto the artifact. "No," the vampire roared. "It is mine. You will not take it." Hendrik rose shakily to his feet, his grip on the lantern tightening. "We're not taking it," he said, his voice steady despite the tears. "We're destroying it." As Nyklas lunged toward them, his weakened form still radiating fury, Hendrik and Lukas prepared for their final stand. The Soulstone was vulnerable, and the time to end Nyklas's reign of terror had come. Chapter 26. The Count's Fall. The chamber trembled violently, the residual light of Father Albrecht's sacrifice still lingering in the air. The once overwhelming crimson glow of the Soulstone had dimmed to a faint, erratic pulse, its power waning, but not yet extinguished. Nyklas von Karstein, weakened and enraged, staggered toward the dais, his monstrous form flickering like a failing shadow. His fiery red eyes burned with desperation and hatred. "You dare defy me?" Nyklas roared, his voice layered with the echoes of countless enslaved souls. "I am eternal. I am von Karstein." Hendrik stood beside the dais, clutching the Lantern of Sanctity tightly, its golden glow now steady and resolute. Lukas Dietrich, bloodied and battered, steadied himself with his rapier, his cold gaze fixed on the vampire lord. Together, they faced the dark creature who had brought so much death and despair to Sylvania. "No," Lukas said, his voice sharp and unwavering. "You're just another monster waiting to be slain." Nyklas lunged with terrifying speed, his claws slicing through the air. Lukas moved to intercept him, his rapier flashing as he struck at Nyklas's exposed chest. The blade pierced flesh and bone, but Nyklas barely flinched, his monstrous strength undiminished by pain. "You are nothing, witch hunter," Nyklas snarled, his claws slashing toward Lukas. "Your faith cannot save you." Lukas dodged narrowly, the claws grazing his shoulder and tearing through his coat. He countered with a precise thrust, aiming for Nyklas's heart. The blade struck true, but Nyklas roared in defiance, grabbing the weapon and snapping it in half with his claws. Hendrik watched in horror as Nyklas grabbed Lukas by the throat, lifting him into the air. The vampire's wings unfurled, and his twisted, skeletal face twisted into a wicked grin. "Your blood will fuel my power," Nyklas growled, his fangs bared, "and your soul will be bound to me for eternity." "Not today," Lukas choked, reaching into his coat. With a swift motion, he drew a silver dagger and plunged it into Nyklas's side. The vampire howled in agony, dropping Lukas as the holy metal burned through his flesh. Nyklas stumbled back, clutching his side as smoke rose from the wound. Hendrik rushed to Lukas's side, helping the witch hunter to his feet. "We can't keep this up," Hendrik said, his voice trembling. "He's too strong." "We don't need to," Lukas replied, his eyes narrowing. "Destroy the Soulstone. Now." Hendrik hesitated, staring at the artifact on the dais. Its faint glow pulsed weakly, as if clinging to its last remnants of power. The whispers that had once filled the chamber were now faint and incoherent, their strength sapped by Albrecht's sacrifice. "If I destroy it," Hendrik began, his voice faltering. "The crypt will collapse," Lukas said. "But so will Nyklas's power. It's the only way." Hendrik nodded, his resolve hardening. He turned toward the Soulstone, the lantern's glow intensifying as he raised it above the cursed relic. Nyklas roared, his voice shaking the very walls of the crypt. "You will not take what is mine." His wings spread wide as he charged toward the dais, his claws outstretched. Lukas stepped forward, blocking Nyklas's path. "Over my dead body," he said, his voice cold and determined. Nyklas snarled and lunged, his claws slashing toward Lukas with deadly precision. But the witch hunter was ready. He ducked under the blow and, with one swift motion, grabbed the hilt of the silver dagger still embedded in Nyklas's side. With a grunt of effort, Lukas ripped the dagger free and drove it upward, straight into Nyklas's throat. The vampire lord let out a guttural scream, his movements faltering as blood poured from the wound. Lukas didn't stop. Drawing on every ounce of strength he had left, he swung the broken blade of his rapier, its jagged edge slicing clean through Nyklas's neck. For a moment the chamber fell silent as Nyklas's severed head hit the ground. His body collapsed in a heap, his monstrous form disintegrating into ash as the Soulstone's power began to fade. Hendrik stood before the Soulstone, the lantern raised high. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by an almost deafening stillness. He hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Hendrik," Lukas shouted, "do it now." Taking a deep breath, Hendrik brought the lantern down onto the Soulstone. The holy relic's light flared brightly as it struck the cursed artifact, shattering the jagged crystal into countless shards. A surge of energy erupted from the days, a blinding light that filled the chamber and shook the ground beneath their feet. The crypt began to collapse, the walls cracking and the ceiling crumbling as the Soulstone's power unraveled. Hendrik stumbled back, shielding his eyes from the light. "Run!" Lukas shouted, grabbing Hendrik's arm. The two sprinted toward the entrance as the chamber crumbled around them. The pair barely escaped as the crypt collapsed behind them, the ground shaking violently as the castle's foundations gave way. They emerged into the open air, the dark clouds above parting as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. Castle Orlock groaned and shuddered, its spires collapsing in on themselves as the entire structure crumbled into ruin. The once imposing fortress was reduced to a smoldering heap of rubble, its dark reign finally ended. Lukas and Hendrik stood in silence, their breaths ragged as they watched the castle fall. The weight of their victory pressed heavily on them, tempered by the loss of Albrecht and the sacrifices made along the way. "He's gone," Hendrik said softly, his voice filled with both relief and sorrow. "Nyklas is gone." "And the Soulstone with him," Lukas replied. He turned to Hendrik, his expression grim but resolute. "It's over." As the sun rose higher, its light bathed the ruins of Castle Orlock in a golden glow. For the first time in decades, the shadow over Sylvania began to lift. The land remained scarred, but the darkness that had gripped it was finally broken. Hendrik looked to the horizon, the weight of their journey settling on him. "Albrecht believed in something greater," he said quietly. "I didn't understand it before, but now I think I do." Lukas placed a hand on Hendrik's shoulder. "He gave us the chance to finish this. That's what matters." The two stood together, the ruins of Castle Orlock behind them and the promise of a brighter future ahead. The Count had fallen, and with him, the nightmare that had plagued Sylvania for so long. Chapter 27. The Aftermath. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky, its warm light cutting through the mist that clung to the ruins of Castle Orlock. The once imposing stronghold, a bastion of darkness and terror, was now nothing more than a heap of shattered stone and ash. The oppressive aura that had permeated the land for decades was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Hendrik Falk and Lukas Dietrich stood at the edge of the rubble, their faces pale with exhaustion. Around them, the remaining villagers from Wolfsback and Dunkelwald emerged cautiously from the surrounding forest. Their wary expressions gave way to cautious relief as they saw the ruins, the absence of Nyklas's looming presence finally settling in. "It's over," Hendrik said quietly, his voice heavy with fatigue. "The Count is gone." Lukas wiped the blood from his brow, his movements slow and deliberate. "For now," he said, "but this land, it never truly forgets." As the Soulstone's destruction rippled through the land, Nyklas's undead forces began to collapse. Skeletons and zombies, once driven by his dark will, fell where they stood, their lifeless forms dissolving into ash. The abominations he had crafted from flesh and bone crumbled, their unholy forms finally succumbing to death. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the remnants of the undead army disintegrated. Some wept openly, their tears a mixture of relief and sorrow for those they had lost. Others knelt in prayer, their voices trembling as they thanked Sigmar for their deliverance. Hendrik turned to Lukas, his expression grim. "Do you think this will be enough? Without Nyklas, will they be safe?" Lukas's eyes hardened. Nyklas may be gone, but Sylvania is far from safe. This land is steeped in darkness. It attracts things, worse things. They'll need to be vigilant. The villagers began the slow process of rebuilding. In Wolfsback, the surviving men and women worked to repair their homes and tend to the wounded. The small chapel, though still in disrepair, became a gathering place for prayers and planning. The Lantern of Sanctity, now dimmed but still intact, was placed on the altar as a reminder of the victory. Hendrik walked among the villagers, his journal in hand. He spoke with those who had survived, recording their stories and their grief. The weight of their losses pressed on him as he listened to tales of families torn apart, homes destroyed, and lives forever changed. One elderly woman approached him, her hands clasped tightly around a worn locket. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You brought light back to this place." Hendrik nodded, though her gratitude felt hollow. "We did what we could," he said, "but the cost." He trailed off, his thoughts turning to Father Albrecht, whose sacrifice had made their victory possible. The priest's voice still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the unwavering faith that had carried them through the darkest moments. That evening, Hendrik sat alone on a hill overlooking the ruins of Castle Orlock. The journal lay open on his lap, its pages filled with notes and sketches of their journey. The lantern sat beside him, its light faint but steady. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Hendrik's thoughts turned inward. He had come to Sylvania as a scholar, a skeptic sent by the Church of Sigmar to observe and document. Now he was a survivor, a witness to horrors he could barely comprehend. "I never truly believed," he murmured, his voice carried away by the wind. "Not in Sigmar, not in any of it. But Albrecht, he believed enough for all of us." The memories of the battle played in his mind, vivid and haunting. The grotesque experiments in Nyklas's crypt, the thunderous collapse of the Soulstone, Albrecht's final prayer, all of it felt both distant and immediate, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Lukas approached quietly, his boots crunching on the grass. He sat beside Hendrik, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're still here," Lukas said. "It wasn't a question." "Couldn't bring myself to leave," Hendrik replied. "Not yet." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the night was broken only by the faint sounds of the villagers rebuilding in the distance. "Sylvania won't change overnight," Lukas said eventually. "This land is cursed. It always has been. But what we did here, it matters." Hendrik closed his journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "Albrecht believed we were part of something greater," he said. "I don't know if I agree. But I do know this, if we hadn't acted, no one else would have." "That's what faith is," Lukas said. "It's not about certainty. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you don't have all the answers." Hendrik nodded, though his doubts remained. He looked down at the lantern, its faint glow a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. "Do you think it's enough?" Lukas rose, his expression unreadable. "It has to be." As Hendrik watched Lukas walk back toward the village, he turned his gaze once more to the ruins of Castle Orlock. The jagged stones jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, a stark reminder of the horrors they had faced. But the darkness that had once surrounded it was gone, replaced by a fragile, fleeting sense of peace. Hendrik sighed and picked up the lantern, its weight a reminder of the burdens they had carried. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would remain. Sylvania was still a land of shadows, but for the first time in decades, there was a glimmer of light. And for Hendrik, that was enough. Chapter 28. A Lingering Threat. The days following the destruction of Castle Orlock were filled with cautious optimism. The villagers began to rebuild their lives, emboldened by the absence of the oppressive darkness that had plagued the land for so long. But for Hendrik Falk, peace proved elusive. The faint whispers started the morning after the Soulstone was destroyed. At first, he thought they were echoes of the battle, memories burned into his mind. But as the days passed, the whispers grew more distinct, low and insidious, like voices carried on the wind. No one else seemed to hear them. Hendrik's nights became restless, his dreams plagued by images of crimson light and the jagged shards of the Soulstone. On the third day, Hendrik stood near the ruins of Castle Orlock, his journal clutched tightly in his hands. The rubble had cooled, the blackened stones now overrun with moss and weeds. He walked carefully through the remnants of the outer walls, his steps hesitant as he approached what had once been the Soulstone's chamber. "Why are you here again?" Lukas asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Hendrik turned to see the witch hunter standing a few paces away, his arms crossed. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his sharp eyes gleamed with suspicion. I don't know," Hendrik admitted. He gestured toward the ruins. "I keep hearing something. I thought maybe." Don't finish that thought," Lukas said sharply. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the rubble. "The Soulstone is gone. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." Hendrik frowned. "And what if it is? Albrecht's sacrifice destroyed the Soulstone, but we never understood the full extent of its power. What if some part of it remains?" Lukas's expression darkened. "If it does, then we deal with it. But don't go chasing shadows. That's how people get killed in places like this." Hendrik returned to the village that evening, but the whispers followed him. They were faint, but insistent, like a distant song he couldn't ignore. As he sat by the fire in the Howling Hound, he flipped through his journal, his fingers tracing the notes and sketches he had made of the Soulstone. The whispers seemed to grow louder the longer he studied the pages. He closed the journal abruptly, his heart pounding. "It's just your imagination," he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. He glanced around the room, hoping for some distraction. The villagers were gathered in small groups, their voices low as they shared stories of survival and loss. Lukas sat in the corner, cleaning his pistol, his expression unreadable. Hendrik hesitated before approaching him. "Do you think it's possible for remnants of the Soulstone to linger?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Lukas didn't look up. "Possible? Yes? Likely? No. Albrecht's sacrifice sanctified the crypt. The Soulstone's influence should be gone." "But what if it isn't?" Hendrik pressed. "What if something was left behind?" Lukas finally looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "Are you hearing something?" Hendrik hesitated, then nodded. Whispers. Faint, but constant. They started after the battle. Lukas's expression hardened. "If you're right, and some part of the Soulstone remains, then we need to find it before it takes root. Sylvania doesn't need another Nyklas." That night, Hendrik couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder and his dreams were vivid and unsettling. He found himself wandering through the catacombs, the jagged shards of the Soulstone glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers called his name, their voices seductive and cruel. He woke with a start, his breath ragged. The faint glow of the lantern on the bedside table provided little comfort. He rose and stepped outside, the chill night air biting against his skin. The village was quiet, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. As he walked the perimeter, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the forest. A faint flicker of crimson light. He froze, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The light vanished, and the forest returned to silence. Hendrik returned to his room, but the unease lingered. He knew he wasn't imagining things. The Soulstone's power wasn't gone entirely. Some remnant of it persisted, waiting, watching. A dark realization. The next morning, Hendrik shared his experience with Lukas. The witch hunter listened carefully, his jaw tightening as Hendrik described the flicker of crimson light. "If you're right," Lukas said, "then the Soulstone wasn't completely destroyed. A fragment may still exist." "But how?" Hendrik asked. "Albrecht's sacrifice should have destroyed it entirely." Lukas shrugged. "Relics of that kind don't obey natural laws. If even a sliver of the Soulstone survived, it could still corrupt this land." Hendrik ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "So what do we do? Search the ruins again? Scour the forest? We barely survived the first time." "We watch," Lukas said simply. "We wait. and if we see signs of its influence, we act. Until then, we can't risk chasing something that might not exist." Hendrik nodded reluctantly, though his unease didn't fade. The whispers still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness they had fought to destroy. As he returned to his work documenting the events of the past weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that their victory had come at a cost they had yet to fully understand. As the days turned into weeks, the villagers of Wolfsback continued their slow recovery. But for Hendrik, the whispers never faded. They became a quiet companion, a reminder that the darkness in Sylvania was never truly gone. Standing once more at the edge of the ruined castle, Hendrik closed his eyes and listened. The faint whispers of the Soulstone called to him, tempting him, warning him. And in his heart he knew Sylvania's shadows had not been vanquished. They had only been tempered. Chapter 29. A Life of Vigilance. The morning sun cast long shadows over the scarred remnants of Wolfsback, its golden rays breaking through the ever-present mists of Sylvania. Hendrik Falk stood at the edge of the village, staring out toward the distant ruins of Castle Orlock. The once menacing silhouette of the vampire's fortress was now reduced to jagged rubble, a reminder of their hard-won victory and the lingering threat that still haunted the land. Hendrik's journal lay open in his hands, its pages filled with sketches, notes, and accounts of the horrors he had witnessed. Every line was etched with the weight of his experiences, a chronicle of their battle against Nyklas von Karstein and the darkness he had wielded. "This can't be the end," Hendrik murmured to himself, his voice barely audible above the faint rustling of the wind. Returning to the village, Hendrik made his way to the makeshift chapel, where the Lantern of Sanctity now rested. It was dimmer than it had been during their journey, its holy light subdued but still present. Hendrik knelt before the altar, his journal set carefully beside him. "I came here as a scholar," he said quietly, speaking to the empty room. "I thought this was just another investigation, another chance to prove that superstition and fear were the real enemies of the Empire." He paused, his gaze fixed on the lantern. "But I was wrong. I've seen the truth. The darkness is real, and it's everywhere. It doesn't stop, and it doesn't sleep." Hendrik closed his eyes, the faces of those they had lost flashing through his mind. Father Albrecht, who had given his life to sanctify the crypt, the villagers who had fought and died to protect their homes, even Lukas Dietrich, whose unyielding determination had been both a strength and a burden. "I can't undo what's been done," Hendrik continued, his voice firming with resolve. "But I can make sure it's not forgotten. I can make sure others know what's out there and how to fight it." Later that day, Hendrik found Lukas near the edge of the forest, inspecting the remnants of a shattered undead guardian. The witch hunter was meticulous, his sharp eyes scanning the ground for any signs of lingering corruption. "You're leaving?" Lukas said without looking up. Hendrik hesitated, then nodded. "Soon. There's nothing more I can do here." Lukas straightened, brushing dirt from his gloves. "And what will you do? Return to Altdorf? Write a book about all this?" "Maybe," Hendrik replied. "But not just for the scholars in their ivory towers. People need to know the truth about what's out here. They need to know how to fight it." Lukas smirked faintly, though there was no humor in his expression. "Knowledge won't save them, Falk. Steel and faith will." "They'll need both," Hendrik said. "But knowledge is where it starts. If they don't understand what they're facing, they'll never survive." Lukas regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "You're not wrong. Just remember what you've seen here is only the beginning. The old world is full of monsters, Falk, and not all of them are as obvious as Nyklas." Hendrik managed a faint smile. "I'll keep that in mind." That evening, Hendrik gathered his belongings in the small room he had been using at the Howling Hound. His satchel was heavier than when he had arrived in Sylvania, now filled with pages of notes, maps, and sketches. He paused as he packed the last of his journals, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. The whispers that had haunted him in the days after the battle were still faintly present, like the echo of a distant storm. But now they served as a reminder, a call to vigilance rather than fear. He strapped the satchel to his back and slung his coat over his shoulders. As he stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him, and he took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. Before leaving the village, Hendrik stopped at the chapel one last time. The villagers had placed flowers and candles around the lantern, their offerings a testament to the hope it had brought them. Kneeling before the altar, Hendrik whispered a silent prayer. It wasn't for Sigmar, or for forgiveness, or even for guidance. It was a promise, a vow to remember what had been sacrificed to bring light to the darkness. "Thank you, Albrecht," he said softly, rising to his feet. As he turned to leave, he found Lukas waiting by the chapel door. The witch hunter gave him a curt nod. "Safe travels, Falk. And don't forget, Sylvania isn't the only place where darkness festers." Hendrik nodded in return. "I won't." With that, he set off down the road, the faint glow of the lantern visible through the chapel windows behind him. As Hendrik walked, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The Empire was vast, and its people were plagued by countless horrors, vampires, necromancers, beasts of chaos. He had seen only a fraction of what the old world had to offer, but it was enough to know that his work was far from over. He resolved to document every step of his journey, every shadow he encountered, and every victory, no matter how small. The knowledge he gathered would be his weapon, a light to guide those who came after him. "The darkness doesn't end," he muttered to himself, "but neither does the fight." With the ruins of Castle Orlock behind him and the open road ahead, Hendrik Falk began a new chapter in his life, not as a mere scholar, but as a witness to the horrors of the old world and a beacon for those willing to stand against them.